God has rescued you from something. Don't tell your business, but look at somebody and tell them, I made it out all right. I made it out all right. I made it out all right. Indeed. I made it out. I made it out all right. Thank you. You didn't leave me no forsake. Thank you. You didn't let my enemies take me. I'm still. I made it out all right. You took it. Ow! Help me. I made it all right. Ooh, made it out all right. Came out of my tragedy and I win. I made it out all right, y'all. Thank you. Thank you. You didn't leave me or forsake me. Thank you. You didn't let my enemies take me. Put their hands on me. I'm still. All over the country, I need to hear you say, I made it out all right. Indeed. Without your hand on me. I made it out all right. Thank you. You didn't leave me. Thank you. You put a hedge around me. You don't let the kids come up. I'm still in the fight. I made it out all right. Who is that? Take it up. I made it all right. I made it all right. Somebody's happy because God did. God did. He did it for me. I made it all right. Thank you. Oh, because Lord, I just want to thank you. You didn't let my enemies take me. I'm still. Listen here. Ricky Dillon. Listen here. I made it all right. I made it. Wow. I made it all right. I had some pain standing around and some misfortune. God showed up and gave me my portion. Say I made it all right. I made it all right. Say I made it all right. The God that brought me out is still making a way. I made it. Anybody in here? Fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Check their fruit. Just as we identify a tree by its fruit, identify people by the things that they
Hey everybody, I want to welcome you back to our quarterly community discussion. Chief, good to have you.
Hey, good to be back.
Yeah, I'm glad you decided to talk with us again. I thought after the last time you might not want to talk to me anymore.
No, this is necessary and it's interesting, and I'm glad to be back. So let's recap.
We've got and we'll get you. And those of you who are watching, you can send in your questions and all that. I'm going to pray and we're going to recap a little bit, get you going. So if you're already on, let your friends know that Bishop McBath and the Chief are on, just talking about the community and their relationships with the police force. And of course, in many ways, Chief can only speak for his own police department, but I'm sure you all have questions that are broader, and he's an expert on this whole issue, and so he can also respond to some of those questions. While he can't take responsibility for what your folks are doing in other cities, but he can certainly.
I got enough on my own plate.
We figured that. Come on, let's pray, everybody. Lord, thank you for how you love the community and you love people, and how your word says that when good leaders are in power, people are happy. But when evil leaders are in power, people grieve and mourn. So we're asking you to raise up good leaders. We're praying that your people everywhere will be people who can rejoice and be happy. We thank you for that. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, I want to welcome you. Thank you for being with us. We know that this is an unusual partnership, a unique partnership, but frankly, this is something that Chief wanted to do. He wasn't coerced in doing it and had to pay him to do it. He wanted to do this. He wanted to have this conversation. He's been proactive in these types of conversations with the community. And I just want to ask you, Chief, and this is kind of a recap because you said it last time. Why is it that you've kind of taken this proactive role? Because we've noticed that a lot of people in your position, it's almost like they're hiding and hoping nobody asks anything. So I'm wondering why you've been willing to kind of come out first and not wait.
Well, I'll tell you, Bishop McBath, we had multiple protests in Norfolk, and one of the very first ones that I attended, there were hundreds and hundreds of young people, and their grievances were real. I could feel it. And I spoke with them, and they were asking me multiple questions about the situation in Minneapolis and the situations that had happened prior to Minneapolis.
Right.
And I'll never forget, one young man said, well, Chief Boone, police chiefs across the country, they say, don't talk back. George Floyd wasn't talking back. They say, don't have weapons on you. George Floyd didn't have a weapon. They tell us not to run. George Floyd wasn't running. They said, don't resist. George Floyd was not resisting.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
and we tell folks to do all these things, and the young man said he still died.
Yeah.
Okay, so that hit me. And I took a position that, I needed to be authentic.
Yeah.
A lot of times in our profession, we try hard to manage a situation, and then there's those times where if you don't speak to a situation with big teeth, everybody know you just lost credibility right there, because
Absolutely.
In that particular situation,
Yeah.
the whole world saw what happened to Mr. Floyd.
Yeah.
And there's nothing I could say to try to modify that, but just tell it like it was.
Absolutely.
So.
Yeah, it's hard to defend against truth.
Right. So, I took a position that, I'm just going to speak with clarity and just tell it like it was, and hopefully it will do good.
Yeah.
All right, not just within my organization, and not just within the city, but throughout Hampton Roads, as well as the state, because the George Floyd incident has changed this profession forever.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so police chiefs, they're going to have to meet these young folks where they are, and we can't dismiss them just because they're young.
Right.
Because any major movement in our country, guess what?
It's always fueled by the
young folks. Martin Luther King.
That's right. I was going to say the stuff we did. I mean, we were young,
Yes.
and that's kind of where it's at. Chief, just a little background. How long you been at this? How long have you been black and blue?
Well, let me put it this way. I've been with the Norfolk Police Department since 1989. I had tried out in the NFL, and unfortunately for me, the NFL meant not for long, and I needed a job.
Yeah.
And I knew I wanted a job that required teamwork, and as strange as this sounds, you had to wear a uniform. And I remember the first time I saw a black law enforcement officer. It struck me, it looked odd. And this was when I was in college. At the games, we would have law enforcement officers working the games. And I remember seeing this large, imposing African-American police officer that was put together, clean and posing, and looked very professional. I could not shake that image because, as you know, I grew up for a large portion of my early life in the projects, and we didn't have officer friendlies, and unfortunately, the officers that I encountered when I was young weren't very kind, and what's left me with a perspective of officers aren't very good people, but that's not true. For the most part, the women and men in this profession are very good people. Now, of course, we have our bad apples, and unfortunately, when they decide to go bad, they make it so that everybody sees it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a visible profession.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate. I often say it's unfortunate when America talks about issues like systemic racism and institutional racism. They act as if law enforcement is the only system
Right.
where there's racism.
Exactly.
But it's just the one people see the most and carries a gun.
Yeah.
So
I say this all the time to my officers. You may go into a community and you may wonder why people look at you with suspicion. Well, there's history behind that.
Yes.
Okay, and right here in Norfolk,
Yeah.
there's history when we talk about the Norfolk 17.
Absolutely.
Okay, we don't have to go way, 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 way back.
Nope. Nope.
Unfortunately,
in our own lifetime.
Exactly. And our profession, unfortunately, have been agents of social control. You can go back again centuries, and everybody knows what I'm talking about. Civil rights, Jim Crow, slave patrol, all that stuff that law enforcement was saddled with. In current day, you have issues with education, you have issues with employment, health, crime, and everything else. And guess who's at the bottom of that ecosystem to catch all that?
Exactly.
Law enforcement.
Exactly.
Okay, and we can't do it all. Okay, we can't do it all, and that's one of the things we have to stop. Okay, a lot of that stuff is systemic racism. Okay, all these folks didn't end up in this area just by
accident.
Exactly.
Exactly
and
right.
then with all that stuff that goes on in those
That's
areas, we got to do a better way or find a better way to address those rather than depending on the women and men of law enforcement.
Yeah, and that's and part of that is a recovery or reestablishing, or maybe even you can't say recovery or reestablishing because that means it was there before, but maybe for the first time establishing relationships that are positive between the community and the folks who are paid to serve and protect. And I think you have some ideas. You mentioned a couple last time, just by way of recap. One of the things that you said that stuck with me is that you came right out and said that the responsibility for developing these positive relationships starts with your
Sure.
women and men, not the community. How do you start that process? What are you doing to get your folks to initiate that?
So this week we went through a series of promotional interviews, okay, and trying to achieve promotion in the Norfolk Police Department, and I suspect in any department, is very difficult, okay. But the candidates will go through a series of questions, and I don't care how well they do on those series of questions, how well they do on their tests, on their assessment. The one question I ask, and this is the very last question, and it's no surprise. Every candidate knows this question is coming. We have developed multiple community outreach initiatives. Which ones have you participated in? And if not, why not?
Wow.
And if they say, well, Chief, I hadn't had time, or I have not, I don't care if they're number one. I'm going to the next candidate. Wow. That's how you change culture, okay? And I'm not naive enough to know that some folks may do these things just because.
Absolutely.
But I will tell you this, even if they do, 9 times out of 10, it's rewarding.
Oh, yeah.
Because they come back and tell me.
Yeah.
So culture change, you know, you have to be intentional. You just can't talk about it.
Yeah.
You tell me somebody that's trying to change culture and they're talking about it without action, I tell you,
Yeah, you got to do so. Chief, I want to get this straight because it sounds just a bit radical. So you're telling me I could be an excellent marksman, I could be in great physical condition, I could have a bachelor's degree in criminal justice, I could be a great police officer, but if I refuse to get involved in community outreach activities, my chances of promotion in your department are slim to none.
It's the latter, none.
It's not even slim.
Right.
It's zero.
It's terrible.
Wow. That well, and that's real culture change.
Yes, and I'll tell you, there was a captain or a candidate for captain who was number 1 3 years in a row, or 3 cycles in a row, and he had not met that threshold.
Yeah.
And I skipped him. But I will tell you this, he's a better captain now because of that. And he's come to me and he said, you know, this is the best thing I've ever done because now I see a different side of policing. All of us, we know how to do the nuts and bolts of this job. Okay, that's what we're trained to do.
Yeah.
All right, the Action Jackson stuff, we get that. Where we are a little deficient is touching people in their hearts, in their minds, and we do a very, very good job of that in the Norfolk Police Department. And I'm not saying we hadn't always done that, and I'm sure there were individuals that did. Right. But we have really, you know, stepped up our game.
Yeah.
Now, for that, you know, there's pushback with that. You may have people say, oh, okay, I'm getting the heck out of here. That's not what I signed. Well, fine. Yeah. Okay, that's
exactly.
fine. Yeah.
That's what it's kind of what we want. You know, it helps us kind of filter out. You know, let you decide this is not the place for you.
Yeah, that's fine.
And so that works. Yeah, the whole idea of emotional intelligence. The average man or woman doesn't even know what it is, let alone have taken a class in it.
Correct.
So, and not the average law enforcement officer, the average person knows nothing about emotional intelligence. And so this is a major step. Now, the other thing for a recap we talked about is the whole issue of bias and the idea that every person on the planet has some bias. You know, nobody can say, oh, I'm totally unbiased. No, everybody's got some bias,
sure.
But for a law enforcement officer, it's how that bias influences you
Their
when
decisions.
you're making a decision.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, you know, every Norfolk officer have gone through implicit bias training. It's one of those things that we mandate as well as other training that we mandate, but the I can't say that. Implicit, I'll get it right. The implicit bias training is something that we start at the ground level with our recruits. And then we have in-service training where we will touch up with the seasoned officers. And in fact, it's been a minute since I've had the training myself, so maybe I need a recap. That's probably why I can't say it.
Well, but you're living it. You're kind of living it out every day. So what's the other thing too is when you're doing it, you're constantly thinking about those biases and how they impact you, and pressure.
But
brings it out.
that works both ways though,
Yes.
because
Yes.
I get a lot of officers that are frustrated that there are those preconceived notions about them as well.
Yes.
They go into an environment and they try to do the very best they can.
Right.
Which is why we educate them. You may go to an area and you're not going to get that instant credibility. You have to work towards it because of some historical stuff. And that's why we try to arm, particularly our young officers, with that information so that they're not caught off guard, because when they're young, they truly believe they can save the world, influence people, make changes, and those changes are very incremental, very small.
Yeah. So. And they can change the world. It just ain't gonna happen in a month or two.
That's
It's
right.
gonna take a while for them to.
Well,
for
stuff
them
like
to do
this, stuff like this,
Yeah.
and will hopefully move the needle. Where we stand as an organization, we want to be challenged. Okay, I embrace the tough questions. When I decided to go meet with the young folks that were protesting, I can't tell you how many city stakeholders said, "Man, don't do that. That's a losing proposition."
Yeah, that's a no-win decision. Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah,
but it was one. It probably was one of the most critical things that I think that happened in the whole protest, because there's something about when someone refuses. It's hard to fight when someone refuses to fight you.
Yes.
It's tough. Some people can do it, but it's real tough.
Yeah.
When you don't approach to fight to start something.
That's
It just makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I remember one young man. They just surrounded me, and he was this close to me, and I could feel his spittle just kicking me in the face as he was yelling and screaming. And I said, "Man, I got to find a way to get out of this," But I said the right things in that moment that they came down, and it was really a learning lesson for me, a lesson I'll never forget. But it was positive. It ended up being very, very, very positive.
Yeah.
So.
All right.
Hey, before we do that,
Yeah.
can I make a plug for one of my very
please.
favorite employees, Adria Moore. She attends your church.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Adria, I put a lot on her plate. Nobody knows my personality better than her, to include my wife. Okay. I am telling you, she knows what kind of mood I'm in by the sound of the keys, how I put them in the door. And I want to highlight her because she assisted me with a article that was highlighted in the International Association of Chief of Police magazine in August. And the article was about our community relations and how we go about developing partnerships, building relationships here in the city of Norfolk. And it got a lot of highlights and thumbs up, and I just want to take this opportunity to highlight Ms. Moore.
Yeah, she's good. She's good people, and not just because she goes to CRC, but she's good. She'd be good people no matter where she went to church. But that's pretty amazing. And I know it's about time for us to take some questions.
Sure.
But I think it needs to be emphasized, Chief, the reason why it becomes the law enforcement agency's responsibility to people of color to take proactive action. Because I just think there's so many people who say, why should we go through all that? Why do we do all that? I mean, come on, they just need to grow up and deal and do what they got to do and get over it.
I think, as you know, I said this to my troops doing this George Floyd thing as a police chief. I envision it like this. There's this tightrope, okay, from this wall to the end of that wall. And I'm on that tightrope. In fact, I'm sitting on this chair trying to navigate from this wall to that wall. And let's envision this having 3 legs. And one leg represents the rank and file. The other leg represents the government. And the last leg represents the community. And you have to strategically shift in this chair to get from this wall to that wall without upsetting any one of those legs.
You need all three.
You need all three. And I can tell you, for a lot of police chiefs, the biggest challenge for them is, how do I navigate in that space with the community without upsetting the rank and file? Right. Because if you don't think I upset my rank and file, some of them, when I went out there and spoke to some of the protesters, it was a very, very difficult time for me professionally, because some members of the agency thought I had abandoned them for the protesters, and that's simply not the case. You know, what I would tell to them, look at the outcome. You have a city in Virginia Beach, you have a city in Portsmouth, and because of the things we've done as an organization prior to the protests, we had no looting, no fire, no arrests, not one broken window. So.
And I think that makes a huge difference, Chief. You know, when people accuse you of choosing sides, then that is the fundamental problem, is that people think that there are sides.
Right.
But at the end of the day, if somebody has been called to protect and serve, then they're certainly on the side of the people that they're called to protect and serve. Even the bad apples that are in that group of people that they're protecting and serving.
We had a series of discussions after that, and fortunately for me, the women and men of this department, most of them, you know, really understood, you know, why that was done, to include, much to my surprise, some retired old crusty officers that I would have never thought would have embraced that. It just really surprised me. And they say, Chief, I completely understand what you're trying to accomplish.
Because it's the only way. It's a three-legged stool. And how's the stool gonna stand without the people?
That's right.
Because the people matter. You know, when you were out there with that sign, that Black Lives Matter sign, I mean, people had issue with that too. But they do matter. And why would you be in the job you're in if they didn't? I don't even get the logic behind that. But we got questions coming. So you all throw them this way, and we'll repeat them.
Good evening, gentlemen. First question is for Chief Boone. Chief Boone, have there been any laws made toward the implementation of a civilian oversight panel?
All right, so the question is, have there been any legislation surrounding a civilian oversight panel? And the answer to that is yes. Here recently, the General Assembly passed legislation that, and I believe is at the option of the city or county whether or not they implement a civilian oversight panel. Here in Norfolk, we are in the embryo stages. The city manager, Dr. Larry Filer, and the deputy city manager, Michael Goldsmith, and myself are putting one together, and with the assistance of the city council, we're going to get their input as to what it will look like. You know, I think a lot of people will be surprised to know there's 18,000 police departments in the country. There's only 160 established civilian oversight boards. So there really hadn't been an appetite for it, but if there has been, maybe there's been some pushback. You know, one of the challenges with these boards is the data shows that citizens have a harder time disciplining officers. That's just the reality.
You mentioned that to me before, and I thought that's an interesting piece of
Look at it this way. This time of year, everybody's feeling good, right?
Yep.
Holidays are coming.
Yep.
And you have an officer that you need to terminate, okay? And you start envisioning his family, okay? And you start to say, let's give him a break, okay? I can tell you where I sit. I struggle with it too, okay? But I know I have to do the right thing.
Right.
And I've been there. I've terminated officers during the holiday seasons because I had no choice.
Exactly. Exactly. And I guess the average citizen may not realize that the things that they're reviewing are not George Floyd type cases.
Right.
You know, there are
Right.
things that they might not think are all that bad, but the police
Right.
department said, no, that's very
Right.
bad.
You're
And
absolutely
when
right.
you need to be disciplined for it. So I can see how that works. How do you maintain that balance, Chief? How do you establish a citizen review board that can properly mete out the consequences for police officers'
Well-
offenses?
Well, naturally, there's going to be some training, okay, involved in this, and they will have an opportunity to look at how historically, okay, the police department have doled out discipline. In addition to that, the way our model will be, we would like to have some retired law enforcement, maybe one officer, okay, because you start saying more than one, everybody starts, no, you didn't say that, Right. So maybe one officer, along with myself, to help train the civilian board. I will say this, and I want to be clear, when it comes to discipline, with respect to our panel, the one we're going to put together here in Norfolk, the discipline will remain with me with respect to the recommendation. I feel as the police chief, I have a good feel for what's appropriate, and I don't want, the community to be lacking when an officer should be terminated, or the officer to be treated in such a fashion where they shouldn't be terminated, okay? So, but the goal is to bring the community into the fold, let them see all the moving parts, how the sausage is made, so to speak.
Yeah.
So,
Chief, in that same vein with that same question, excessive use of force, these kind of issues, what is the legislation looking like in terms of citizen review boards of fatalities, excessive use of force, those kind of issues, the one that get in the papers and the press and all that?
so officer-involved shootings, let me speak to Norfolk first. The way they are handled here in Norfolk, we have the state police do the investigation. Okay, they handle the investigation. Once they are finished with the investigation, it's turned over to the Commonwealth Attorney for a recommendation, legal shoot or not, okay? With respect to excessive force, depending on the severity of it, okay? Because, we average about 50 excessive force complaints a year, and most of them are found unfounded, meaning it didn't happen. So excessive force could range from, well, he put my arm behind my back too hard, right, or it can be the use of capstun, pepper spray, or it can be the deployment of a canine dog, or it could be a strike to the body. So it's on various levels depending on the severity of it.
Got it.
If it's something that's so severe, all right, I'm going to dole it out for someone else to investigate.
Are those things, do citizen review boards address those types of issues?
They're going to see it all.
Okay.
Yeah, they're going to see it all. It's important that they see it all, but again, the final say-so with respect to discipline, I will stay with the chief of police.
Which is consistent.
Yes.
The consistent nationally. So
Yes.
I know that's the way the legislation, because you should be ultimately held responsible, for that. I mean, at the end of the day, you should be the man that they say, he's the one who finally made that call.
Yeah.
That makes sense, Chief. Next question.
So this question is for the both of you. What are some barriers to good police-community relations, and what steps can be taken to eliminate them?
What are some barriers to good police/community relationships, and what can be done to remove some of those barriers? Well, I'll I'll start with saying, to me, the greatest barrier for any relationship is arrogance. When people are so arrogant that they don't recognize the need for the other person, then that's the greatest barrier, I believe. The second barrier, I think, and Chief has mentioned this on occasion, and that is people who are just simply naive of history and issues and those things that create certain struggles. When people don't know, the lack of understanding, just not knowing what you're walking into, I think that's the second. So even some education and emotional awareness, and then I think at the end of it all will be simply when there's no desire to work it out and walk it out together, and you can see that certainly on both sides of this particular issue. However, the responsibility, as Chief always says, still starts with the police department, but you can see that response both ways. I don't know, Chief, you can.
Yeah, one of the starting points in building a relationship is that first encounter. That's where you're going to have a vibe for, okay, where is this going to go? Okay, one of the things we teach our officers is procedural justice, okay, treating people simply with dignity and respect. But that goes both ways, okay? I cannot tell you how many times someone will complain on an officer that she or he was rude, and then we go take a look at the body-worn camera, and that's not the case. The case was the citizen was rude at the initial onset of the encounter, and we expect that, okay?
Sure.
We're trained to absorb that. But there comes a time where we have to take control of a situation, and taking control of a situation, it doesn't always look pretty, okay? And I don't care who you are. If you're doing something that requires the officer to do something within his or her training, it's not going to look pretty. So, what I say to the barriers, you hit on all of the ones that I've typically talk about, but what's important is that first encounter. Okay, how are we going to treat one another?
Right.
And fortunately for us, since we've implemented body-worn cameras in 2014, right after the Ferguson thing, citizens get a little bit polite, a little bit more polite, as well as officers when they know everything.
I was gonna say, I bet everybody gets a little more polite. So Chief, here's my question about what you just said, and this is not so much a Norfolk issue, because I have good testimony. I've never had any problem with a police officer in the city of Norfolk. Now that's not, I've been pulled over before and told I just look suspicious, and I'm not sure how that worked because I was in a red pickup truck with my son going to basketball practice. But that wasn't.
Did it work out?
That wasn't on your watch. It worked out,
Okay.
because I did what Mom and Daddy told me to do.
Well, you said, "Do you know who I
I was
am?"
nice. Nope, did not. He to this day he doesn't know who I am.
That's happened to me as police chief.
I didn't know. So you've been. We won't talk about your DWB, your driving while black issues right now. But why is it so often, Chief, what you mentioned, this tension issue? Why does it seem to happen so frequently? I think out of proportion to people of color and even whites who are not well-to-do.
Okay.
Why is it? It seems so out of balance.
Let me put my police hat on, my police chief hat on. So there are thousands of police encounters a year. Okay, 99% of them go the way they're designed to go correctly. All right, so let me take my police chief hat off. When it comes to encounters with African Americans, sometimes there is a barrier with respect to understanding. Sometimes there is impatience on behalf of the officer, and sometimes there's an issue with cultural competency. Okay, so it goes both ways. When I tell young men, because generally that's what the issue is, young African American men, when you're encountering with law enforcement, bring it down, okay? Don't come at them with, why the F are you stopping me? Because all that's going to do is bring them up, okay? But at the same time, what I tell my officers, let's be professional, and I know you're stressed, okay, when someone's coming at you, and you get it so much that, your patience level may not be where it needs to be, bring it down. But then there's that cultural competency thing that, and I said this before, as an organization, and when I say an organization, I'm talking about throughout the country, we have to do a better job at selecting the right people, okay? All right, that's where it starts.
Bobby Scott said that the real answer, and of course, this is oversimplified by a politician. He's my buddy, but still a politician. Bobby Scott said the way we fix this is we get people of color policing people of color. We change the color of the police department. But that's just a lot easier said than done because you're trying to get people to trust you. Now you're trying to get them to come and work for you. I would say, Chief, that recruiting officers of color is probably not the easiest thing, even for an officer of color.
It just got harder with the recent incidents and across the country. It's gotten more difficult because, the George Floyd situation, you got folks in their households saying certain things about the police, about the incident, and that influences young people. You got folks that are still living that were here during the civil rights era. And there's conversations at the kitchen table, and
Absolutely.
that influences young folks.
Absolutely.
So I can tell you, when my family learned I was being a policeman, they said, "What the hell is wrong with you?"
Have you lost your mind?
Yes, and this particular side of my family, they're very educated. Okay, I'm talking about doctors, professors, lawyers. They like, what the hell is wrong
So
with
you're not even talking about the project
Right.
side of
No,
the family.
I'm not
You're
talking
talking about the other side of the
I
family.
expect the project side of the family to say that. The other side, I was shocked, And to this day, they have a real suspicion of police.
Absolutely.
To this day.
But here I'm a pastor, and when I look to this day, when I look in the rearview mirror and see that the guy walking up looks more like me, there's something in me that immediately relaxes just a little bit. Now I've had experiences where I realized that was no help at all.
Well,
But
let me address something that was stated. What I've learned, and some of what Mr. Scott said is accurate, just based on what you just said. Okay, that feeling of comfort. But I can tell you, I have multiple Caucasian officers that are in African American communities that the African American community absolutely loves. And this isn't no tongue-in-cheek thing, okay?
Right.
Because I've seen how these officers navigate in those communities. Yeah. I can tell when they're comfortable. I can tell when they're genuine. I can tell when it's the opposite as well.
Yeah. And I'm sure, Chief, you've had enough experience to see where African American officers in African American community are not are not real comfortable.
I've seen that as well.
So that goes both ways, but there's still that responsibility that comes back to the officer to de-escalate and bring it down, like you said, and the ability to do that is, it's challenging.
Well, it's people talk about police officers, going to work and deciding, well, I'm not going to do my job. I'm just going to sit in my car, and I want to take a chance of becoming recorded so everybody to see throughout the nation. But I can tell you, the women and men of this department, they've gone to work. Crime is down, believe it or not, 20% in this city. Okay. Now, I'd be naive to think that, there was a time period shortly after the George Floyd incident and everything that happened here in Hampton Roads that they didn't say, whoa, okay, because I had some say, okay,
Yeah.
I'm doing something else, okay.
Yeah.
But the women and men that have remained, they're committed to this job and this profession.
Yeah. It means a lot. Next question, you all.
All right. Chief Boone, could you please explain briefly what the Marcus Alert is and what it could possibly look like for the Norfolk Police Department to incorporate the Marcus Alert?
All right, so the question is, what is the Marcus Alert legislation that passed recently? The history behind that was a young man out of Richmond. He was going through a mental psychosis, and he was encountered by law enforcement. This happened in Richmond. And he was unclothed, and he was very aggressive, and he would charge the officer. He would run away from the officer into traffic and charge the officer. It was a very difficult situation for the officer. Unfortunately, the gentleman was killed. The officer ended up shooting the young man. So what we're trying to do now is, the Marcus Alert is to ensure that law enforcement is equipped to better address those situations. A data point that sticks out is when you talk about officer-involved shootings, 20 to 25% of the time when those occur, it's surrounding someone with mental health issues. Yes. So what we want to do now is when we respond to those type of calls is have a buddy with you, a health clinician person where they're more apt to deal with that type of stuff. Now, we wouldn't want them to be placed in
Harm's
harm,
way.
right? And so we're going to try to do our best to minimize that. And we're in the embryo stages of formulating our response to mental health issues right now. So we'll have someone riding with a police officer responding to those type of calls. We're thinking about, retract that, we're not thinking about, our officers that will be assigned to this unit will have like polo, khaki pants, things of that nature, so that they don't appear so imposing when they go to these type of calls as well. So I embrace that idea because I can tell you here in Norfolk we have too many officers going to those type of calls, and most of the times if it turns out where the officer has to transport the individual, they're going to Centera, and by the end of the day, I got 10 cars out there, okay,
Right.
where I really need to be on the street.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
but on that note, we have about 770 authorized officers in terms of authorized strength, and every one of our officers have been trained in CIT, and but at the same time, we got to pull back. I have a challenge when we send badges and guns to everything,
Right.
We got to find a way to minimize our footprint in those areas where things can go south.
Is it conceivable, Chief, that there could be a template developed where there in every police department there is a staff of officers who are kind of dually trained? They're certified law enforcement officers, but they have some counseling training, some background. I mean, is that one of the things that I know that's not always easy in a smaller city because funds are limited,
Right.
but is there the possibility rather than defund, but refund and take some of that and develop officers who, since if 25% of the calls, somehow, or the struggles that end up taking place involve someone who is mentally incapacitated. And I'm just wondering and I know, I'm thinking the police department probably does not want that, but it's going to end up like everything else. It's going to come to you anyway.
Yeah, well, it's already come to me.
Exactly.
That's kind of
Yeah.
what we're putting together right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at 4 officers and I think 8 folks from the mental health arena to try to put a model in place where we're no longer sending officers and full uniform by themselves to these type of calls, and that's moving across the nation as well.
Yeah.
And there's some out west that's established, that's going very well. Again, when I think of most of officer-involved shootings, it tend to involve someone going through some form of mental psychosis that doesn't end up going well. So
one of the things too, that if you live in our city here in Norfolk, one of the things the police chief has encouraged you to do is, if you have a student living there, a child living there, a young adult that you're responsible for who has any kind of mental issues, any imbalances, autistic adult, then the police force, let them know, because our police department will make note of that, so that they know that on this particular street or in this particular house there's that possibility, because we know there's a family that has that particular challenge. And so many of you may not know that, but want to make sure that you know that that's the kind of information that the department here wants to get from you, for the very reason that the chief shared, because oftentimes the officers are pulled into situations that they don't have any knowledge of, and that knowledge would help out significantly. Question?
Yes, I have a two-part question for you, Chief Boone. Do the law enforcement officials communicate between cities to make relations better? And if so, how do we get all of the police departments in the 7 cities to adopt you and the Norfolk Police Department's no outreach, no promotion policy?
I'm glad they asked you.
wow. So the first part of your question, do the police departments across Hampton Roads communicate? We have what we call a 7 city chiefs meeting. We meet quarterly, and we talk about current events, what's going on, and what's going on in their department, what's going on in my department, laws, tools of and equipment and things of that nature. So we communicate quite frequently. Now, with respect to your latter part of your question, no community engagement, no promotion. I don't know what other cities do with respect to that. I'm sure they have their own benchmarks where they want their candidates to meet. I took this initiative because I wanted to, one, find a way to get us involved in the community. And, you know, the best way to do that is you got to impact what somebody wants, okay? And I know folks will say, again, like I said previously, well, you're getting people where their heart really isn't there. Trust me, by the time they're done, their heart is there. For the most part, believe it or not, most officers, they want to do these things. They just don't know how. Right. Okay?
Right.
So it's important that leadership show them how to do these things. They get stuck in their head that, you know, I got to be this macho cop and I got to be Joe Friday and this is the way it is. We got to break down that mindset, and we are doing a fairly good job of that here in Norfolk. I will say other departments are starting to catch on. I think you'll see some highlight some of their initiatives on the local news channels. I'll say this, any police department, particularly in an urban setting, that aren't doing some of these things, stand by. Yeah. They're going to have their hands full when that incident occurs.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
and I know that the question was for the chief, but let me say what he can't say. Most of them aren't doing it because everything rises and falls on leadership. And so if you're in a community where those things are not happening, you need to be at city council, you need to show up, you need to bring it up, you need to ask, what are our police officers doing in community outreach? What are the requirements? Is it totally voluntary? Is it just by volunteering? Are they obligated to get involved in that? Do they take any emotional intelligence classes? Or that you need to go ask those questions, because what the chief can't do is he can't legislate the standards of his police department on other police departments. He can suggest, he can give ideas, he can set the example. But as a citizen, you need to understand that these folks get paid from your taxes. And so if you want some changes, then I want to encourage you to make your way to city council meetings, get it on the agenda, have the discussion, find out what's going on, and put the pressure on for folks to make some changes, because those changes are going to have to be made. And the chief said it very nicely, that if these changes aren't being made, and especially in urban settings, it's going to be tough. It's going to be hell to pay if those changes don't start getting made in urban settings. It's absolutely will be. And so if you're hearing this and you're in a city, you're not sure how proactive, you need to go find out. And you and everybody else needs to be talking about it and pushing it forward. Because as a citizen, what's the blessing of being in this country is you got a voice, and so you need to use it.
All right, Chief Booth, have there been any recent legal updates surrounding no-knock warrants in Virginia?
So the question is, any recent legal updates surrounding no-knock warrants in the state? Basically, what we're talking about here is the Breonna Taylor law. And the answer to that, yes. The governor here recently just signed that into law here in Virginia. And basically what that looks like, it's precluding law enforcement from making immediate entries. And what immediate entry is, if I have a search warrant or an arrest warrant for Mr. Joe, and I go to 6 Quarry Circle in Hampton, Virginia, and Mr. Joe resides there. In the past, I didn't have to knock, okay? I just
Knock
make
the door
that,
down.
Yeah, knock the door down. And that's kind of what happened in Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky, regarding Breonna Taylor.
Right.
And also in that particular situation, it was at night. Okay, so some of the things we have to do now where we didn't have to do in the past, if we wanted to do an immediate entry or no-knock search warrant, we own that. When I say we, and I'm speaking for Norfolk, we could just put the search warrant together and go do our thing. But now there's some oversight. Okay, now we have to get the approval from a judge or a magistrate, particularly for those search warrants at night. And if we do a search warrant, we have to knock, and we have to announce ourselves, and we have to be in uniform. Before, we could be dressed like me, you know.
Right.
So
Right.
One of the things I heard went wrong in Louisville with Miss Taylor was, they had been watching this location for a very long time, and when they decided to go to the address, some of the folks that were involved in the initial planning couldn't make it. So they brought in folks that had no idea what the plan was, okay? Wow. And they went to execute the warrant, and as you know, things went south. So that would be the equivalent of, a football team going somewhere to play a game, and 3 of the players couldn't make it, so you just grab somebody off the street. That execution is going to be flawed.
Oh, yeah.
So, and I'm not saying they brought anybody off the street.
Right, but they brought people that weren't trained, that didn't know the plays.
Right.
So Chief, as a police officer then, does that weaken my ability to address crime? Because that's oftentimes what we hear, is that all these laws are making it hard for the police to do their job. So
let me put it this way. It depends, okay? I know that sounds a bit feeble, but it depends. There are some cases, very minor, okay? Most times you can execute the search warrant just as the law is written, okay? Right. I'll say 95% of the time, all right? Just as the current law is written. But there are times where you're going after a really serious individual, and we have always relied on that element of surprise, okay? So now, if we don't have that element of surprise where we can just make that entry, we don't know what this individual is armed with. We know his mentality. So it puts the officer at a little disadvantage because historically we've always depended on that element of surprise so that the officer goes home safe and hopefully the suspect as well. So that's the chink with respect to that legislation that I have some challenge with.
Will the law allow for the detective or whoever's in charge to do their due diligence in that 5% case, go to and get a different warrant that would allow him, if he can prove that this is a situation where we can't knock? Is there any out for that 3 to 5% cases where you're dealing with a situation like that?
The way it's written, I don't think so. I'm not 100% sure, but I don't think so. Yeah, so there are those situations that I would rather err on the side of caution and let the officer make the entry and maintain that element of surprise. And the other piece of that is, you know, there may be evidence in there that the individual may destroy. But let me preference that comment with this. There's no amount of dope or drugs worth, you know, someone's life, okay? So the way I stand on that, you know, if they flush it, they flush it, okay?
Right.
All right, so.
Exactly.
You
I
know.
got you.
And what we started doing here in Norfolk, we wait you out, okay? We just wait you out, wait for you to come out, okay? And that has worked.
Mm. Yeah. Oh, yeah, gotcha.
And I think this will be our last question for the evening.
Really?
Wow, where did the time go? Wow.
Chief Boone, this question is for you, but Bishop.
You don't say. You don't say.
In your opinion, how will the transition of power at the White House affect police reform initiatives at the local level?
Wow. So I had an opportunity to meet the vice president when he came here to Norfolk. And I can tell you, typically, let me just answer, it's going to affect policing, the type of policing that I embrace positively, okay? I think you'll see a lot of changes with respect to building those relationships, community engagement requirements. They kind of went sideways with the last administration. The last administration was more law and order, okay? With Mr. Biden and Ms. Harris, they're law and order as well, but at the same time, you know, there's another arm to that law and order, and that arm is community relations. So I embrace the transition. I think you'll see Mr. Biden pick up where Barack Obama left off. And I think you'll see community relations take a leap where it's never been taken before. Okay.
That's interesting. As a police officer, Chief, I want my community protected. I want to go home and I want to know nobody breaking in my house. I got grandkids. I got a wife. You know, I want protection. So for me, as a homeowner, as a citizen, I want protection, and I want good community relations too. I want law and order around my house.
Sure.
But I want good community relations too. Is it possible, Chief, that working with communities can actually work to establish law and order long term? Is there any police value to community relationships?
Absolutely. You know, here's the deal. A lot of the educated type, researchers type, they know for certain, okay, that crime reduction can happen through effective police deployment. We know that for certain. Right. Over here, the data says that community relations don't necessarily improve crime, all right? I disagree with that, and here's why. I can tell you since we started this strong community relations initiative, if you looked at our bar chart, which we'll post next month, you'll see the crime in Norfolk just, boom, historical lows. You can tell from the hard work that we've done over the last 5-6 years with respect to reaching out to those organizers that do protests. Okay, there's a reason why we didn't have looting and rioting, because of
There's a relationship.
If we had looting and rioting, that would have went over here to the right column and increased our crime.
Exactly.
So from where I stand, okay, and where we're going in the future, and I said this before, if our profession don't find ways to interface authentically, okay, with our communities, crime's going to go up.
Yeah.
Okay. I would rather have every citizen's eyes and ears, okay, on what's going on in the city rather than the officers that I have.
Absolutely.
Because that just it serves as a force multiplier.
Absolutely.
I can tell you with respect to how we go about solving crime, we have citizens' input.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know folks are in the CSI and all that stuff, but I'm going to tell you how a lot of our crime is solved. Mr. Joe calls their community resource officer and says, you know, I have some information.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
I'd like to tell you.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And I would say that's in primary, you know, any police department across this nation that has those strong relationships. It is paramount that police departments have a good working relationship with their communities, all communities.
Yeah. And I'm absolutely convinced that many of our Caucasian counterparts in their communities who police their own communities and feel they have relationships with the police department to come and help them police their neighborhoods do very well. If we could then do the same thing in predominantly African American communities, where we would then police our own communities and we knew we had backup and help in doing so, I could see crime going way down quickly.
There's, you know, again, you know, crime is impacted by socioeconomic status.
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
as long as, you know, certain communities is challenged by that, there's just going to be crime.
Absolutely. Because if you only got $1 out of every $10 in wealth in a community, there's not a lot of home ownership, there's not a lot of sense of ownership, and that changes the game. I know we're out of time, you all, but my name's Courtney McBath. I'm with Chief Boone. He's the police chief of Norfolk and has been a part of this police community here in Norfolk since 1989.
Yeah.
So we're glad for you the NFL meant not for long because we got blessed out of that. So we're grateful for that. We want you to know as community citizens that we want you to be a part of this process. Chief is working to do the legal thing, and that is working to get the community review board, that kind of thing going. But we want you to continue to interact with us, ask us questions. We'll come and talk. So as long as Chief is willing to have the conversation, I'll have the conversation, and hopefully it'll do some good. If you had a question that you didn't get answered, you can just shoot us an email at info@crcglobal.org, info@crcglobal.org, or put it in the chat, and we'll do our best to try to answer those questions. Thank you all. Chief, thanks.
All right. You always do that.
That's because I'm good. I'm negative.
You were thinking since your last test.
Since the last test. That's right. Last time I checked, I was. Bless you all. Thanks for being with us.
It was meant to kill me, sent to destroy me, and I thought that it would, and And I thought that it should, 'cause I messed up so many times. I went left when you said right. I'll understand if you wanna let me go, let me go, let me go. But you held on to me, and you wouldn't let me go.